In this video, we revisit the exact spots where history's most famous photographs were taken and see what they look like now. Raising the flag on Iwo Jima, Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima, Japan. The photograph Joe Rosenthal made on February 23, 1945, of 6 Marines straining to plant the Stars and Stripes on the summit of a volcanic island in the Pacific. The most reproduced image of the Second World War, and the model for the Bronze Memorial in Arlington. The island, now officially called Iwo To, has been returned to Japan and is closed to the public, occupied only by a small detachment of the Japanese self-defense forces, the black sand still littered with the rusted remains of the battle. A modest memorial stands on the windswept peak where the flag went up, reachable only by veterans and officials flown in for ceremonies. The most famous hilltop in American military history, now one of the most inaccessible places on Earth. The photograph seen by everyone, the ground seen by almost no one. VJ Day in Times Square, Manhattan, New York. The Kiss, Alfred Eisenstadt caught on August 14, 1945. A sailor sweeping a woman in white into an embrace, as the news of Japan's surrender swept through the crowd, the image of a war ending and a relief no one could contain. The intersection still the most photographed crossroads in the world, but transformed from the gritty wartime square into a blazing canyon of digital billboards and costumed characters, sanitized and corporate and packed with tourists posing where the kiss took place. The spot where a city exhaled at the end of a war, now a place where it is impossible to find a moment of quiet. The spontaneity of that day unimaginable on a sidewalk, now choreographed for the camera. Lunch atop a skyscraper, Rockefeller Center, New York. The photograph from September 1932 of 11 ironworkers eating lunch on a steel beam hanging 690 feet above Manhattan, legs dangling over the void with no harnesses, taken during the construction of the RCA building at the height of the Depression. The building still standing as 30 Rockefeller Plaza, the beam long enclosed within finished floors, the rooftop now the top of the rock observation deck where tourists pay to stand safely behind glass at roughly the height where the men once balanced on nothing. The most vertiginous photograph ever staged, taken on a girder that is now buried deep inside a completed tower, the terror of the image sealed behind office walls. Tank Man, Chang'an Avenue, Beijing, China. The image from June 5, 1989, of a lone man in a white shirt standing before a column of tanks the day after the Tiananmen Square crackdown, shopping bags in his hands, refusing to move, photographed from a hotel balcony above the Avenue of Eternal Peace. The wide boulevard still runs past the square, busier than ever, but the spot is among the most surveilled stretches of pavement on the planet, lined with cameras and plainclothes police, and the photograph itself is scrubbed from the Chinese internet so thoroughly that most young citizens have never seen it. The most famous act of defiance of the 20th century erased in the country where it happened, the road where the man stood now, a place you cannot photograph without being watched. Migrant Mother, Nipomo, California. The portrait Dorothea Lange took in March 1936 of Florence Owens Thompson, a 32-year-old mother of 7 staring past the camera with worry etched into her face, taken in a freezing pea pickers camp during the Depression, the defining image of American hardship. The camp gone without a trace, the muddy field of canvas tents replaced by ordinary farmland and roadway near the small town of Nipomo, a roadside marker the only acknowledgement. The most famous face of American poverty photographed on a patch of California dirt that now grows crops in anonymous rows, the woman in the picture not even knowing for decades how famous her exhaustion had become. The terror of war, Trang Bang, Vietnam. The photograph the Associated Press distributed on June 8, 1972, of a naked 9-year-old girl, Phan Thi Kim Phuc, running down a road screaming, her skin burning from a napalm strike, an image so harrowing it helped turn a nation against a war. The stretch of Route 1 where she ran, now an ordinary paved highway through Tay Ninh province, lined with shops and traffic, a memorial marking the place. Kim Phuc surviving her burns, emigrating, and becoming a peace advocate. The road where she nearly died, now carrying motorbikes past the spot where the most famous photograph of the Vietnam War was made. The Burning Monk, Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. The image Malcolm Browne captured on June 11, 1963, of the Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc sitting in perfect serene stillness as flames consumed him in the middle of a Saigon intersection, a protest against religious persecution that stunned the world. The intersection, now a busy junction in modern Ho Chi Minh City, marked by a memorial park and a statue of the seated monk wreathed in stone flame, while the very car that carried him to the spot, a pale blue Austin sedan, is preserved as a relic at a pagoda in Hue. The most shocking act of protest ever photographed, commemorated with a quiet shrine in the roar of a city's traffic. Raising a flag over the Reichstag, Berlin, Germany. The photograph Yevgeny Khalday staged on May 2, 1945, of a Soviet soldier hoisting the red flag over the smoking ruins of the German parliament as Berlin fell. The image of the Third Reich's end, later retouched to darken the smoke and remove a second looted watch from a soldier's wrist. The Reichstag rebuilt and reborn as the seat of a reunified German democracy, crowned in 1999 by a soaring glass dome designed by a British architect, where visitors now climb a spiral ramp above the very chamber the photograph showed in flames. The building that symbolized one nation's defeat transformed into the transparent parliament of another, tourists circling above the debating floor where the flag once flew over rubble. Abbey Road, St. John's Wood, London. The album cover Ian McMillan shot on the morning of August 8, 1969, of 4 Beatles striding single file across a zebra crossing outside their recording studio, a 6-photograph session that produced the most imitated image in music history. The crossing still there, repainted and slightly relocated over the years, now a Grade 2 listed landmark watched by a live webcam, mobbed daily by fans who hold up traffic to recreate the walk, while drivers wait with the patience of the long resigned. An ordinary pedestrian crossing turned into a pilgrimage site, the studio wall beside it endlessly covered in graffiti and painted clean again, the most famous 10 seconds of walking ever recorded, replayed thousands of times a week. The Tetons and the Snake River, Grand Teton National Park, Wyoming. The photograph Ansel Adams made in 1942 of the Snake River curling silver through the valley below the jagged peaks. An image so iconic it was etched onto a golden record and launched into deep space aboard Voyager to represent Earth to the universe. The overlook's still there, the mountains unchanged, but the view subtly lost. The lodgepole pines that were young saplings in Adams's day, now grown into a tall forest that hides much of the river's grand bend. One of the most reproduced landscapes ever photographed, slowly erased not by development, but by the trees themselves. The perfect composition now impossible to repeat because nature kept growing. Guerrillero Heroico, Havana, Cuba. The portrait Alberto Corda took on March 5, 1960, of Che Guevara at a memorial service in Havana, his gaze fixed on the middle distance beneath a beret, an image that became the most reproduced photograph in the world, printed on more t-shirts and posters than any other. Corda never charging royalties, the face spreading across the planet as a symbol of rebellion, commerce, and everything in between, Havana itself frozen in much the same revolutionary era it represented, the city of crumbling grandeur and vintage cars, where the photograph was made now selling that same image to tourists in every souvenir shop. The face of anti-capitalism becoming the most commercialized portrait in history, sold a few streets from where it was taken. Afghan girl near Peshawar, Pakistan. The portrait Steve McCurry made in December 1984 of a 12-year-old refugee with piercing sea-green eyes, photographed in the Nasir Bagh camp, where Afghans had fled the Soviet war, an image that became one of the most recognized magazine covers ever printed. The girl, Sharbat Gula, not identified for another 17 years, the sprawling refugee camp itself eventually closed and cleared as the displaced moved on or returned to a country still at war. Gula herself displaced again decades later, granted refuge in Italy in 2021 as the Taliban retook Afghanistan. The most famous refugee in the world photographed in a camp that no longer exists, her image permanent, her home never settled. The Saigon execution, Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. The photograph Eddie Adams took on February 1, 1968, during the Tet Offensive, of a South Vietnamese general firing a pistol into the head of a bound prisoner on a Saigon street. The bullet's impact frozen forever. An image that won a Pulitzer and haunted both the photographer and the man it made infamous. The street, now an unremarkable corner of a booming Ho Chi Minh City, shops and traffic flowing past with nothing to mark it. The most disturbing instant of the war captured on a sidewalk that has dissolved completely into the ordinary life of a city that won the war, the photograph helped lose. The view from the window at Le Gras, Saint-Lô-de-Varennes, France. The oldest surviving photograph in the world, made by Nicéphore Niepce around 1826, by exposing a metal plate for hours through an upper window of his country estate, capturing the blurred rooftops and courtyard of his property in the first permanent image ever fixed by light. The plate itself now preserved in a sealed case in Texas, the house where it was made still standing in the French village, the window still looking out over a courtyard and the Burgundy countryside. The first thing a camera ever saw still there to be looked at, a quiet rural view that happens to be the birthplace of every photograph that followed. The Boulevard du Temple, Paris, France. The image Louis Daguerre made in 1838 of a Paris street, the first photograph ever to include a human being, a man who happened to stand still long enough to have his shoes shined while the long exposure erased all the moving traffic around him, leaving him alone on an empty boulevard. The street later swept away in Baron Haussmann's reconstruction of Paris, the medieval boulevard of theaters replaced by the wide avenues of the modern city. The first person ever photographed standing on a street that no longer exists, his identity unknown, immortalized only because he paused to clean his boots. The Falling Soldier, near Córdoba, Spain. The photograph Robert Capa took in September 1936 of a Republican militiaman thrown backward at the supposed instant a bullet struck him during the Spanish Civil War, one of the most famous and most fiercely disputed war images ever made, argued over for decades as either the purest capture of death or a stage tableau. The rolling Andalusian hillside where it was taken, now quiet farmland under the same wide sky, unmarked and uncertain, scholars still debating the exact spot. The most debated photograph in history, taken on a slope so ordinary that no one can even agree where it is. The Magnificent 11, Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. The handful of blurred, grainy frames Robert Capa salvaged from D-Day, June 6, 1944, shot from the waterline as men waded ashore under fire, most of his images destroyed in a darkroom accident, leaving only 11 shaking pictures of the longest day. The beach, now a broad, peaceful expanse of sand where families walk dogs and children play. The American cemetery on the bluff above holding the white crosses of the men who never left it. Memorials standing where the landing craft once dropped their ramps. The most violent morning of the 20th century, captured on a beach that is now the very picture of calm. The 7-year itch subway grate, Lexington Avenue, New York. The photograph from September 1954 of Marilyn Monroe standing over a subway grate, her white dress billowing up as a train passed beneath, filmed before a crowd of thousands at the corner of Lexington and 52nd Street, and reproduced endlessly ever after. The grate still set in the sidewalk, the corner an ordinary stretch of midtown Manhattan where office workers stride past without a glance. No plaque, no marker, just pavement. The most famous image of the most famous movie star of the century, made on a patch of sidewalk that millions now walk over without knowing what once happened above it. Bliss, Sonoma County, California. The most viewed photograph in the world, the rolling green hill beneath a blue sky dotted with clouds that Charles O'Rear shot in 1996, and that became the default desktop background of Windows XP, seen by over 1 billion people on screens around the planet. The hill itself, once bare grassland where a vineyard had been wiped out by disease, later replanted with rows of grapevines, so that the smooth green slope of the photograph is now covered in a working vineyard and no longer matches the image at all. The most familiar landscape in human history changed beyond recognition. The perfect empty hill that lived on 1 billion screens, existing now only on the screens. Wait for Me, Daddy, New Westminster, British Columbia, Canada. The photograph Claude Detloff took on October 1st, 1940, of a regiment marching off to war as a small boy broke from the crowd and ran into the street, arm outstretched toward his departing father, an image of a child reaching for a man going to fight. The street's still there in the Canadian city, and at the very spot a bronze memorial unveiled in 2014 recreates the scene, the marching soldiers and the running boy cast in metal forever. The boy, Whitey Bernard, growing up, his father coming home from the war, the most tender photograph of a nation's departure, now a statue standing on the corner where it happened. Dewey defeats Truman, St. Louis, Missouri. The photograph from November 1948 of a grinning President Truman holding aloft a newspaper that had wrongly declared him the loser of the election, taken as his train paused at Union Station, the perfect image of the press getting it spectacularly wrong. The grand old railroad station, once one of the busiest in the world, long since emptied of trains and reborn as a hotel and entertainment complex with an aquarium and a Ferris wheel. The most famous political photograph of an upset taken in a temple of rail travel that no longer runs a single passenger train. The Babe Bows Out, the Bronx, New York. The photograph Nat Fine took on June 13, 1948 from behind, of a frail and dying Babe Ruth leaning on a bat as his number 3 was retired before a packed house, the bowed back and the broad stadium saying everything the face would not. The old Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built, demolished after the 2008 season, a new stadium raised across the street, and the original site turned into a public park called Heritage Field. The most poignant photograph in the history of American sport taken in a stadium that has since been torn down to its foundations. The spot where Ruth stood now, an outfield of ordinary neighborhood ball games. The surgeon's photograph, Loch Ness, Scotland. The grainy image published in 1934 that appeared to show a long neck and small head rising from the dark Scottish water, the picture that launched the modern legend of the Loch Ness Monster and drew seekers to the lake for generations, revealed 60 years later to have been a hoax built from a toy submarine and a sculpted head. The loch itself unchanged, vast and cold and genuinely unfathomable, its shores now lined with monster museums, gift shops, and tour boats sweeping the depths with sonar. The most famous fake photograph ever taken, still drawing millions to a lake to look for a creature that a confessed prank invented. The Flatiron Building, Manhattan, New York. The wedge-shaped tower that Edward Steichen and Alfred Stieglitz photographed in the misty early 1900s, capturing the strange new skyscraper rising like the prow of a ship through the rain at the crossing of Broadway and Fifth Avenue, an image that helped define the dawn of the modern city. The building still standing, instantly recognizable, but recently emptied of its offices and wrapped in scaffolding as it is converted into luxury condominiums. One of the most photographed buildings in the world, the very emblem of the early skyscraper age, being hollowed out and remade into apartments more than a century after the camera first fell in love with it. Earthrise and the Apollo 11 boot print, the moon, and finally the photographs whose locations no human can ever revisit. Earthrise, made by the astronaut William Anders on Christmas Eve of 1968 as Apollo 8, came around the far side of the moon, and the blue Earth rose over the gray lunar horizon, the first time our world had ever been seen whole and alive against the black, an image credited with launching the modern environmental movement. And the boot print Buzz Aldrin pressed into the dust of the Sea of Tranquility in July 1969, photographed sharp and perfect in the airless lunar soil, a print that, because the moon has no wind and no rain, is still there exactly as he left it, unchanged after more than half a century, and likely to remain for millions of years. The only places in this entire list where the scene looks precisely as it did in the photograph, untouched and unvisited, waiting in perfect stillness on a world we have not returned to.